Great. So hi, everyone. Welcome. Um, my name is Erica, but we're here for Dan to talk about nutrient triage and prioritizing food groups for better health. Really, thank you all for being here today and taking the time to learn from Dan. He is a registered dietitian and diabetes educator in our office at Providence Community Wellness and works at a couple of the clinics around town. Dan is awesome. We're really excited to have him here today, so we appreciate you all listening in on his presentation. So from here, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any questions for Dan as we're going along through this presentation, you can pop it in the chat or in the Q&A feature at the bottom as well. I'll put a message here in the chat quickly so you can all see it and know where to put in those questions, or again in the Q&A there. We'll try and get to all of your questions at the end. We've set aside some time for Dan to be able to go over some of your questions. So feel free to throw any and all questions or comments that you have for Dan in the chat or in the Q&A. And again, we'll try and get those answered as soon as we can. This is being recorded, and we will send you all out a copy of the recording as well in the next couple of weeks, so you can watch it again on your own time. All right. So with that, Dan, I'm going to hand it off to you, and you can take it away.
All right, thank you, especially to Erica. I literally don't know if I could have done this without you setting this up. And thank you to everyone, especially if you're listening to me on your lunch break. So nutrient triage, this is, let's just call it a quick phrase that I've used over the years to, I guess, orient people to, well, prioritizing their food choices, especially within a clinic setting. We're often on a time limit, really compressed time schedule. So I want to get as much information out as possible in as much of a succinct manner as I can. Oops, let me advance here. So this is our agenda. Prioritizing food choices. I'm going to talk a lot about that, of course. Another thing is simplicity, keeping it simple and adaptable. You know, we can make nutrition about as complicated as you want, but more often than not, I find that that's just not necessary. You know, we like to focus on what's the best diet, what's the best supplement, so on and so forth. Often, for most people, we need to kind of roll back and keep it simple to start. So this is my housekeeping slide. We're not going to be talking about diets. So this is not about high carb, low carb, high protein, so on and so forth, keto. This is about talking in the context of nutrients. That's why I use that term nutrient triage. We often get, I think, overly focused on singular nutrients like protein, fat, carbs. And in reality, you know, nutrition, how I view it is it's often a rolling average over lifespan. It's not just what happens in a day or a week or a month. Yes, within certain contexts, we may have to do that, but overall, want people looking at the big picture and thinking about nutrients in their diet versus these isolated situations. This isn't medical advice. Yes, I'm a registered dietitian. However, if you have a specific medical condition that entails a lot of dietary modification, you need to go to your physician and hopefully a registered dietitian for that. And last but not least, this is nothing new or earth-shaking, shattering. I did not invent this. I have adapted this quick phrase and the flow over time and experience just working with people and using it on myself as well. So I would like us to pause a little bit on this slide. So diatia, ancient Greek for diet, way of living. So think about that for a second. We use the term often diet in the context of, once again, isolating or excluding a nutrient, just focusing on weight loss or a medical condition. I think the ancient Greeks had a good viewpoint. If That's what they really considered the word for. Way of living. We all need to eat. We all need balance and nutrients. Yes, we may have to modify our food choices based on certain conditions, but overall, once again, going back to that concept of nutrition really is a lifelong rolling average. What we do over time likely matters more than just these isolated little segments in time. Below Socrates, nice little quote there. It's often attributed to Benjamin Franklin. He also used this: eat to live, not live to eat a lot. Okay, here we go. So we're going to go around the circle here. We're going to start with protein. And why are we doing that? Bottom line, protein is essential. We cannot make protein and then hence amino acids by ourselves. We need to ingest protein in order to have those amino acids to utilize for all of these things. Growth, repair, maintenance. I won't go through the whole list. Let's just say protein's involved in pretty much every bodily process. You see a nice little picture there with some sources. Here we go down the list. You know, protein really, when you really step back and look at it, not a huge list of foods. That is advantageous in a sense. That makes education a little bit more simple. However, it can make it more complicated if someone is on a restricted eating pattern, or they don't like a certain category, or maybe for reasons like allergies, they can't eat a certain category. So it can become a little bit more complicated and difficult meeting protein needs if those situations are in play. More wise, protein sources. So going to the left, I apologize, there's a lot of raw meat there and fish. But protein sources are generally come with a complement of micronutrients. So what's that term, micronutrient mean? That's our vitamins, our minerals, other chemicals that are found in food that are either essential or beneficial to our body. I didn't include this in the slide, but macronutrients, you may hear that term once in a while. Those are your protein, fats, and carbohydrates. The terms micro and macro just generally refer to whether we need a lot to meet our needs or small amounts. So generally with vitamins, minerals, we don't need huge amounts in our daily diet to meet basic needs. However, protein, carbs, fats, we generally on a gram by gram basis just need more. So wanted to clear that up if there's some confusion on terminology. Protein, it's generally considered the most satiating nutrient. By that term, we mean satisfying, alleviates hunger the most. A lot of that's due to the hormonal response of protein, or in response to protein intake, and also is those amino acids, the end product of protein gets into our bloodstream. Our body says, hey, you're fed, you're good to go, you can stop. I thought I had to add this last little asterisk. Protein, it's highly unlikely to be converted into fat. So that becomes advantageous in certain scenarios where maybe we're trying to lose weight, or maybe there's a concern if I tell someone to eat more protein. I have had that response, well, am I going to gain a bunch of weight if I increase protein? Well, if you're lifting weights, you're likely to gain more muscle mass. But as far as conversion of protein to body fat directly, you know, hypothetically it's possible, but really hasn't been observed in human trials where they fed the participants an enormous amount of protein and then traced the metabolism of that protein to see, what happens at the end if we eat a lot. And generally, what is found is it gets used up. Our body's very efficient at using protein. Going back to that previous slide, once again, most bodily processes, if not all, need protein in some regard. There's a pretty high demand. Okay, we've covered protein. Now we're going to go to produce. Now, I do realize that produce is not a nutrient. But once again, I want the focus on what are food groups or categories that offer a lot of nutrition for the amount you're getting in. So generally, produce has a lot going for it. So for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to be using fruits and vegetables. We could probably throw some other things in there, but once again, keeping it simple, let's just isolate this produce discussion to fruits and vegetables. So why? Number one, fiber. Plants are a very good source of fiber. Most population studies show that fiber intake in a given range has beneficial health effects. Calorie-wise, generally produce, you're getting a lot of nutrients, but relatively low calorie intake. That's advantageous in a lot of scenarios. And just like protein, we've got a lot of micronutrients, okay, vitamins, minerals. Let me explain this last word, phytochemicals. That just means plant chemicals, simply. That's often referring to like some of the colorful pigments that are actually active in our body and may have beneficial effects. For instance, antioxidants, there's vitamins that are classified as antioxidant, but there's other chemicals like these colorful pigments in plants that aren't classified as a vitamin or mineral. In fact, some phytochemicals are actually active hormones in our body, or can act like hormones in our body. Here's one of the better principles when we're thinking about produce is variety. I often get asked this very question: what are the best fruits and vegetables? What are the worst? What should I eat or not eat when it comes to fruits and vegetables? Obviously, outside allergies or other medical conditions where you might have to limit a certain fruit or vegetable or a whole class. For instance, if you're on blood thinners, your doctor may have told you to limit or avoid foods that are high in vitamin K. Okay, that's an isolated incident. We're just talking broadly. Variety wins out every time. There's no best. There's no superfoods. You see that promoted a lot, mainly with supplements. Usually if you hear superfood, there's a tagline that's trying to sell you a product where they've maybe isolated a certain nutrient out of that food. Just practice variety. If you don't like a lot of fruits and vegetables, keep experimenting. Try them different ways of preparation. Cooked, canned, raw, there's benefits to all of it. If someone, say, for instance, came in to see me in the clinic and they said, I can only afford canned vegetables, it works best for storage for me, then I'm not wasting it. Are there any drawbacks to that? Possibly. Maybe those canned vegetables are very high in sodium and that person needs to watch their total sodium intake. So we'll just discuss that part of the problem. But as far as is one better than the other, not necessarily. Some nutrients, like on this picture here, we've got some tomatoes. That red pigment which is called lycopene, is activated by heat, and then your body can absorb it much more readily. If you eat only raw tomatoes, you're unlikely to absorb most of that nutrient. So once again, variety wins out over trying to pick out the best or exclude the worst, which there really isn't any of. And on the topic of, let's be adaptable with this principle of nutrient triage. Say, for instance, you have diabetes, or your doctor said, hey, your blood sugars are elevated, and you're trying to look at the carbohydrate sugar content of your diet. Well, okay, then we can lean more heavily on, say, vegetables that don't have as much starch or carbohydrate that'll affect your blood sugars. Not saying fruit is bad, but once again, this is an example of how you can adapt this principle to pretty much every scenario if you have to. I'm moving kind of quick, so we'll probably have lots of times for questions here. So starches. This is probably the category I get asked about the most. I didn't put it last because it's the worst, but I'll explain that in a little bit. So generally, when we're thinking of starches, what are starches? They are just long chains of glucose bonded or sugar bonded together. Our body breaks that down for usable energy. Now, foods that tend to have a high starch content, let's just say they've been demonized in general. We've been back rather, in the idea that all carbohydrates are bad, carbs are fattening, they're bad for us, we should never eat them. That is not necessarily the case. Once again, there may be scenarios where you do have to watch your carbohydrate or especially starch intake. But in general, they're fuel, and more whole grain foods, for instance, are going to have that higher fiber content. You're going to also have the micronutrient content similar to fruits and vegetables, vitamins, minerals, and there's those plant chemicals again. So before I move on, once again, stepping back and looking at this as a bigger picture of trying to see our food as, am I getting nutrients in? Am I getting a balance of nutrients versus saying this food is bad because of this, XYZ? That's often not the case. So there's some sources. In general, here's the problem when we talk about starches. A lot of our intake of starches is from processed foods, often highly processed foods. So for instance, you have these nice whole grains that have fiber, their natural micronutrient content intact. That can be very beneficial in a lot of scenarios. Okay. Now, if you extract the starch, which often comes with extracting the fiber, the micronutrients, you compress it into this nice, tasty package that hits all the right triggers in our brain, and we overeat them. And then you're in energy surplus, hence you can gain weight. Backing up a little bit, that doesn't mean that starches or carbohydrates are automatically going to convert into fat in our body. That's not exactly how our body works. Going back to that example of weight gain, that happens in the state of surplus. Okay, that's what our body's more or less designed to do. And I made sure I put our tubers on there, potatoes, yams, so on and so forth. Those are a food that are often looked at as just bad. But once again, going back to micronutrients, things like potatoes, yams, sweet potatoes, tubers in general, there's a lot of micronutrients within that food. It's not just a starch. So how do you apply this in everyday life? Okay, let's use shopping as an example. A lot of people have probably heard the shop the perimeter, right? You start at the produce section, maybe you're moving on to the meat section, dairy section, a lot of whole foods in all those sections. Of course, then everyone jokes, and then we end at the bakery aisle. But in general, you can use this principle of nutrient triage very readily and practice that shop the perimeter. I started doing that with my son when he was really little. First stop at the store is produce section. I would have him just pick out whatever produce he wanted. I didn't care. If it was some strange fruit neither one of us had ever seen, buy it. Let's see if you like it. Okay, moving on, we get to our protein section. Moving on again, dairy, picking out likely protein foods there as well. And then, you know, if we end up getting starches like rice, potato, so on and so forth, there you go. And of course, I had to put that reminder down there. Don't shop hungry. I think all of us have done that. That tends to send you in the reverse pattern. At least it does for me. Let's go down the middle aisles and pick out all the tasty stuff first. That doesn't always work out well. So applying this, let's say, to an individual meal, here's how I generally do this in practice. I have people establish their protein food for that meal, whatever that is. It can fit within whether you're vegetarian, vegan, or you eat all animal products. Just find and pick the protein foods you like, establish those. Then we move on to produce. Once again, you can adapt that. If you're, for instance, once again, watching your blood sugars, well, maybe you do want to lean more on vegetables that have less carbohydrates that will move your blood sugars up. Maybe someone doesn't need to worry about that. They want to include more fruit. Maybe they're exercising a lot. So those sugars present in the fruit are going to be used as fuel for that activity. Good. That's going to those individual needs. Okay, and then lastly, once again, starches. It's not saying don't eat starches. This isn't a discussion on portion size. Okay, so maybe once again, we have someone who's running marathons and they do really well with a higher carbohydrate intake. Well, then even though I still want them to practice protein first, we need that. We already talked about that. Include some produce for that fiber and micronutrients. And then you need the fuel, fill up on starches. You know, ideally, once again, the least processed, the better. And I had to include vegan tacos. I realized I've had a lot of slides with an abundance of animal proteins. One little thing I wanted to mention, since we are good on time, Brazil, their dietary guidelines, I just found them recently, very much matches what we're discussing here, but even more basic. In fact, I love their dietary guidelines for Brazilians. One of their biggest focuses is not on eat X amount of servings of this food group and this food group and exclude this food group, kind of like our old food guide pyramid did. That information can be usable to some people, but when you start, especially let's say an hour visit in a clinic, someone's seeing me for diabetes management, and I'm throwing out, oh, you need to eat 8 servings of this and this and this and this many grams, my eyes start glazing over quickly, even though I might be the one saying it. It's not very usable information. So in those guidelines, they more or less emphasize eat minimally processed foods most of the time whenever possible. Okay, so their focus is on let's get whole foods as much as possible to get those nutrients in versus arbitrarily focusing on certain food groups as being good, bad, super, so on and so forth. So looking once again, that big picture. And that was very quick. So if Erica's okay with it. Oh, let me finish this slide. I had to throw this in. I love bell curves. There's a saying, life is a bell curve. So trying to just aim for balance, practicality, not going too far in any direction unless, of course, there is a very specific reason for that to happen. This applies to pretty much most settings in life. Okay. We get too much, probably not good. Too little, yeah, probably not good. And there's a range of what you could call optimal. And actually, before I open it up for questions, here are some upcoming events. If you'd like to read those off, take our number down. We have an excellent webinar coming up next month about stroke prevention with one of our doctors.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
I do have a couple questions for you here in the chat that have been sent to me. The first one asking about protein. They say, I know I'm supposed to eat protein and I know it's important to my diet, but they're a little bit confused on how much is enough and is it possible to get too much?
Beautiful. So let's start with, is it possible to get too much? Highly unlikely. Once again, though, this isn't me seeing someone in the clinic for a very specific medical condition. So there can be scenarios where you may have to limit protein. That is a question for your physician and or registered dietitian if you're seeing them on a formal basis. In general, no. Okay, there has been, I think, a little bit misunderstanding on protein in the kidneys, and we're talking about people with healthy kidneys. Does it damage your kidneys? Will it cause kidney damage? No, not for healthy kidneys. That's been well researched and established. Yes, if someone has, for instance, chronic kidney disease in certain stages, there may be a recommendation to not necessarily limit protein, but not go too high. Once again, that's very situational. Now, onto the question of how much. And I'm glad we have a little bit of time. We were talking about this morning here in our office. There's a variety of calculations out there. Okay, so bare minimum established recommendation. Okay. So we may or may not have lost part of that recording. So in case it wasn't being recorded. I'm trying to see here. So protein, 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram. That can be a rough estimate for most individuals, but also understanding that's based on body composition. Most of these studies were done basing the 0.8 to 1.2 on either lean body mass or people that are on the BMI scale of normal. And I do put air quotes up there for that. So that is a much more nuanced discussion. If depending on, once again, body composition. If you have a lot of muscle mass and you're very lean, then that's going to be more accurate. If it's the reverse, lower muscle mass, more adipose or fat tissue, that is going to over calculate for most people the grams of protein they may need. So for most people, honestly, if they're getting 60 grams or above, that's really a bare minimum number. Don't take that as the absolute number. That would lean more towards women, men, minimum 80. Once again, in the context of this lecture, I don't really want to go too deep into that because it does get nuanced and a little bit confusing. You can find online calculators, but be leery once again, if they're just using total body weight and then the calculation, that can skew that number a little bit high. Once again, that may not be a bad thing, you know, eating more protein, provided you don't have any medical conditions that would possibly have you restricting protein to a degree. But it's an intimidating number if that calculation is off. It could be in the 100 some grams, and you may look at that and go, I can't eat that much protein. So take those calculations a little bit with a grain of salt.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan. The recording was my fault. We've got some fun connectivity issues, so the joys of Zoom, but I think we're back on and should be good now. So I apologize for that. A couple other questions here for you, Dan. Someone is asking, what veggies have less carbs, starches, and how do you know if you're getting enough nutrients?
Well, there's some tough questions. I like it. In general, most vegetables are going to be relatively low starch. With the internet, you can individually look up, you know, carbohydrate content of certain fruits, vegetables, so on and so forth. Most vegetables, though, in general, it's just, you don't have to worry too much about it. You know, there may be some isolated foods like peas that have a little bit more starch. People often point to corn. Corn is not a vegetable, it's a grain, and it is more starchy. But once again, how much corn are you eating, for instance? And why is someone maybe looking at starch content of vegetables? What is going, I would want to know more about what's going on with them medically. Now, we won't do that here, but that's an important discussion. As far as how do you know you're getting all the nutrients? Well, without extensive testing, you probably couldn't know that, but that's not the point of overall nutrition. If you're not excluding entire food groups, overall you're eating at least a semblance of balance. You're eating protein foods, you're eating produce, grains, or maybe not. You're likely going to meet those needs. It's usually in instances of malnutrition that, of course, well, the word says it all, that we would look a little bit deeper and get lab work. I didn't want to make it too complicated in that regard and just practice that variety more than anything. Most people are going to be just fine with that.
Someone is also asking specifically about the potatoes that you mentioned. Is there a big difference in starch content of the different kinds of potatoes?
No, not enough to matter. In fact, you know, sweet potatoes have more sugar than a white potato. that white potato's been, oh, let's just say demonized, in the low carb culture. So no, it's really just preference. Which one do you like more? We just tend to do other things to white potatoes, right? Mash them up, cover them in gravy, slice them up, salt them, deep fry them. Whereas, for instance, sweet potatoes, we tend to eat as a whole food. That's usually where the problem lies, not the food itself.
Yeah, how it's cooked, right? Great. And then another question here, specifically going back to the proteins and the meats specifically, there's so much said about high cholesterol and needing to reduce meat intake from that, like fatty versus lean. What are your thoughts on that?
That's another, boy, that's a whole other lecture right there. In general, going towards leaner meats might be a good idea for the sake of just shaving off calories. If you need the extra calories, yes, eat fatty meats. As far as the discussion on blood cholesterol levels and that whole picture, it gets a little bit more complicated with the studies that have been done that kind of point towards, say, red meat being linked to other chronic diseases like cancer. Most of those studies really actually don't show much, if any, significance in the grand scheme of things. As far as your blood cholesterol goes, that's another highly individual thing. Some people, you may see a rise in cholesterol levels with a higher saturated fat intake, which that's tends to be the higher percentage of fat in animal proteins. But that, once again, is a much more nuanced discussion. I would just go back to, most of us, we're getting enough calories throughout our day, and if that's the case, then leaner is better, just once again to get some of those extra calories we may not need out of our diet.
The last question that I think I'm seeing here in the Q&A, I want to double check that that's the only one I'm missing. Oh, not. Disappeared on me. I'm having some fun technical issues today. Oh, okay. There's one, the last question I'm seeing in here in the Q&A is about vegetables. They say don't like raw vegetables and just looking for some tips. They say about different ways to cook some vegetables to make them a bit more enjoyable.
Well, my first question would always be, what have you already tried? So we can kind of eliminate those possibilities. But I mean, the sky's the limit. Here's how I tried to hide vegetables with my kid. Of course, he always figured it out very readily, but I also, just moving forward, do it all the time. If I make a stew or a chili or other kind of mixed dish, automatically just dump in a bag of vegetables, or saute them in olive oil on the side. It's really something you have to experiment with. I can't necessarily say, oh, this is the way that's going to be better or worse, or you're going to like. It's really just experiment. Look up recipes, try different things, try adding them to other foods, like I mentioned. Adding some vegetables into, say, chili or stew often is a good complement, makes it more enjoyable. And if you don't really like them that much, well, the flavors of everything else are going to cover it up a little bit.
Great.
It's a good question.
Great. There's a couple more that came in as you were talking. There's a question about the upcoming events that are on the slide and fees associated with them. And there are some fees associated with some of these programs, but not all of them. So if you have that question, I'm it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So I want to make sure we're hitting the other questions. So if you have questions specifically about the programs that are listed on here or about any fee, if there is one associated with them, feel free to either call that number that's on your screen or just email us. And then I'm happy to help out with some of those questions as well. Specifically, you're asking about that weight management program. Happy to answer any questions about that. Just go ahead and give us a call or email that email, and I can answer any of those. Someone else is asking about refrigeration and freezing rice, potatoes, and pasta. Does that affect the glycemic index if you freeze them or refrigerate them?
That's a great question. Yes, so if you take a starch like rice, pasta, potato, you cook it and then cool it, you don't have to necessarily freeze it. It creates what is called a resistant starch. So it actually changes when we cook a starch, it starts releasing those bonds. So it's a little bit more available to our body for digestion. When we cool it, the starches rebond in a different way that makes them resistant to digestion. So it's harder for our enzymes to clip those bonds and make it, or basically become free glucose. So yeah, that is a technique, and I suggested that to people. It's why you might see some people walking around eating green bananas deliberately, I should say, is when they're unripened, they are a resistant starch. As they ripen, that starch is converted, or those bonds are broken, and it becomes more free sugar. So yeah, that's a great question. And that's a fairly easy technique you can do at home if you're, say, wanting to have a starch with your meals, but maybe you have diabetes and you want to have that food but optimize your blood sugar control. That's a reasonable technique you can experiment with. Other than, one word of warning, you're probably going to be bloated the first few times you do that, because those starches that make their way past the small intestine in the enzymes are going to be fermented, kind of similar to a fiber in our large intestine. So you may have a little bloating and discomfort. Or generally, if you keep doing that, you'll adapt to that.
Right. Continuing on that conversation of starches, another question here: are there any essential starches that you need to have?
Essential? No. Yeah. That's where, boy, all of you are giving me some excellent ideas for future talks. Our body can make glucose on its own out of protein. So is there any essential dietary, as in coming in from food, starches? Technically, no. Technically, no.
There is a follow-up question to the question earlier about freezing and refrigerating some of those starches you mentioned, specifically looking for a number, how many grams of carbs it would be reduced by, is their question.
That I don't know. That is going to, and that wouldn't be a question I don't think anybody could answer without a formal study looking at how many grams of glucose, or what is the rate rise in blood sugar of a resistant starch versus an equal amount from, that same food category. Even though I always say we're all humans, but we're all different, right? So your level of enzymes to break down starch might differ from mine. So that wouldn't be a very predictable thing without doing a formal study tracing the metabolism of that food in a given individual. I know that's not a great answer. I would still look at, if you're doing that for, say, managing your blood sugars for diabetes, I would still start with, this is the total carbs, and then watch your blood sugar response. That's going to give you more usable data in real time for that scenario.
Great, thanks, Dan. Last one that I'm seeing here, you talked a little bit about some different studies that you've read on various research being done about some of these topics. Someone is asking in the chat, how much does the science back the blue zone food cultures?
I'm not even sure what the blue zone is.
Yeah, we might need a little bit more explanation on that question there, if possible.
I've heard the term, but more often than not, when I keep my nose in the science stuff and down into the biochemistry sometimes, so some of these other things, my patients educate me as much as I do them, which I really appreciate.
Great. Well, that is the last question that I am seeing. I think I touched on all of them. So I think we are done. Dan, thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for attending and joining us here today. If you have any following questions once we're done, feel free to just shoot us an email and we're happy to try and help out in any way. And then we'll send out a recording as well once we get that uploaded too. So Dan and I will hang out here for just a few more minutes if anyone has any last minute questions, but otherwise, thank you so much and for spending your lunch here with us today. And we hope to see you next month to talk about stroke prevention.